What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be checking out a topic I think will be very interesting, and that is, what are the differences between Scottish and English DNA? Now, obviously the Scottish people and the English people live on the same large island of Great Britain, but over time we know that numerous people have come in and populated this island over the centuries. You know, you have the Celts, you have the Picts, you have the Anglo-Saxons, and I believe the Normans, the Vikings. Who else? I have no idea, but it seems like there's been a lot of people coming together and mixing in some regard in this land here that we call Great Britain. And I'm really curious where on average the English people and the Scottish people land within their mix of whatever groups were a part of this mixing. By the way, guys, before we get started, I just want to mention that this video comes to us from the channel Celtic History Decoded. If you're interested in checking out their channel, link as always will be in the description. But enough rambling from us, let's go ahead and dive in here and check out the differences between Scottish and English DNA.
What are the DNA differences and similarities between Scotland and England? Now, so much has been said about Scotland and England over the years, yet there has been very little genetic comparisons between the two. So that's exactly what we're going to do in this video, and we'll also look at the different rates of physical traits and genetic conditions between Scotland and England. Now, both these countries initially formed into early kingdoms in the medieval period. Scotland in 843 AD and England in 927.
Wow, that's close.
They then developed over the centuries into the countries we recognise today with their modern borders. In 1707, England and Scotland unified into the Kingdom of Great Britain through the Acts of Union. Yet their people retain some distinct cultural and genetic identities that we will look at in this video. Now, the DNA story of Scotland and England doesn't just apply to the people that live in these countries, like myself in Scotland today. It also applies to so many people across the world, as so many people have Scottish or English ancestry, or a combination of the two. As you can see in this table, the United States, Canada, Australia and New Zealand have the most amount of people with at least one of these descents across.
That's
I guess
insane.
that makes sense.
But yeah, it does make sense.
It's so shocking to see it that far ahead of the rest.
Wow, 55 million.
Across the globe, with over 50 million people having Scottish or English ancestry in the United States. People who live in Scotland and England also often have mixed ancestry as well, of course. But what are the main genetic differences between Scotland and England, and how different are they? And please let me know in the comments below if you have Scottish or English ancestry and what your ancestry is in general. Now, both of these people trace the majority of their ancient ancestry to three main sources: Western hunter-gatherers, early European farmers, and then steppe ancestry. However, studies have found subtle differences in the rates of these components. For instance, Scotland has slightly higher levels of both steppe ancestry and Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. England, on the other hand, tends to have a bit more early European farmer ancestry. These differences are quite subtle, however. Now, a significant divergence in the ancestry of Scotland and England came in the early medieval period, beginning around the 5th century AD. This was when the Anglo-Saxons arrived, who of course had far more of an influence on England than Scotland. This impact was especially high in certain parts of England, with a 2016 study estimating that on average, the contemporary East English population derives 38% of its ancestry from the Anglo-Saxon migrations. The impact of the Anglo-Saxons does seem to vary in different parts of England, however, with it much lower in parts of the north. In contrast, Scotland retained more of its indigenous Celtic and pre-Anglo-Saxon DNA. Although we do see some impact on parts of Scotland, mainly in the lowlands and the southeast of the country.
Okay, so this is interesting, and it makes sense that the Anglo-Saxon influence on the English tends to be greater in more southern regions and less when it gets to more northern regions as you're getting closer to Scotland.
And yeah, it would make sense that the more southern part of Scotland would have more Anglo-Saxon influence.
Right.
Difference is also reflected in the haplogroups found in the modern populations of Scotland and England, something we will look at later in the video. But what about the Vikings? Well, the impact of the Vikings was actually different in Scotland versus England. Although the Vikings had a genetic influence on both populations, there was a different regional impact. Vikings from the land we call Denmark today had a much greater influence on English DNA, whereas Vikings from the land we call Norway today had a much greater impact on Scottish DNA.
That's interesting.
There was also regional differences within Scotland and England as well.
Okay, I honestly don't know anything about the Vikings much, so I didn't know they were from different areas, honestly.
I didn't either. So Norwegian Vikings were more towards Scotland area.
And Denmark.
Which makes sense because it's more north.
Right.
And then the Swedish Viking, or wait, Denmark.
Denmark, yeah.
Is more
Wow, that's interesting.
England.
As you can see in this table, the impact was highest in the Northern Isles of Orkney and Shetland, but also notable in the Western Isles of Scotland and Eastern England. This influence in Eastern England
That would make sense to
largely a
Eastern
legacy
England.
of the Danelaw period. Now, I should note as well that there is a difficulty when looking at the genetic impact on England of Danish Vikings versus Anglo-Saxons from Denmark, as both had similar genetic signals. With this being said, the overall impact of the Vikings on Scotland and England was probably quite similar, at around 6 to 10%.
Almost the same.
That's honestly kind of surprising. I thought it would be much higher toward the more
In
north you go.
Scotland,
Yeah, honestly, I did.
As far as Viking haplogroups, two in particular are worth mentioning: R1A, Z284 and I1. These markers are still found in Scotland and England today, and we'll go into more detail later in the video on Scottish versus English haplogroups. Before we look at the haplogroups of Scotland versus England, I first wanted to look at the different levels, the different frequencies of physical traits in Scotland versus England, as well as genetic conditions. Now, basically, there are two types of physical traits that are higher in Scotland than England. The first one is red hair.
Red hair.
Scotland
okay.
has the most amount of redheads on the planet alongside Ireland.
Wow.
In Scotland, around 10 to 13% of people have red hair, and roughly 40% also carry at least one red hair allele.
I love red hair.
Look at that.
I know.
Did you see, like, Ireland and Scotland are very
About the
similar
same.
in terms of redheads.
But Scotland is a little ahead.
Right.
And then Wales. And then the UK on
UK in
average.
general, an average in France, Germany, Netherlands, Norway, Denmark. Where does that trait originate? Was that Celtic mainly, or was that something else? I've always assumed that the redhead would be more of a Celtic thing.
I do too, but I don't know
in my head.
why.
I don't know why. That's just something
Maybe
I have in my head.
movies or something.
Yeah, but look at the U.S. 1.5 to 2%. Wow.
I love red hair though.
Yeah.
Have red hair, and roughly 40% also carry at least one red hair allele. Only between 4 and 6% of people in England have red hair on the other hand. This is still higher than the global average of 1 to 2%, but obviously much lower than Scotland.
Right.
This disparity aligns with the idea that the red hair genetic mutations were more common in Celtic fringe populations of Britain and Ireland down through history.
Okay.
The high frequency in Scotland, as well as in Ireland, points to genetic drift or selection in those populations, and red hair is also high in another population who speaks a Celtic language, in Wales, the Welsh. This again speaks to a Celtic link with red hair.
Okay.
And on the subject
So
of
we're right
physical
about that.
traits,
Yeah.
Scotland also has slightly higher levels of blue eyes than England, with
Hold on.
around 50% in Scotland compared to 48% in England.
Wow.
Wow, look at Estonia.
Where?
89% at the very top.
Oh my goodness.
Then
Why is
Finland,
that?
Sweden, You know, I'm assuming Estonia is far north. Mm-hmm. So the more farther north you are, the more you need to allow sunlight in because there's less sunlight, right?
Yeah, that's true, and that's why that's true, and that's why lighter eyes tend to be more prevalent in northern climates, right?
Yeah.
Wow. So here's my brethren, right here. This is my
You
brethren.
and Sophia.
Yeah, that's true. Where you come from?
Oh, well, I'm not.
Now, another genetic trait that's higher in Scotland than England is hemochromatosis, an inherited
we
condition
learned that
where
in his
iron
other video
slowly
we
builds up
watched.
in the body. This iron overload can damage parts of the body such as the liver, the joints, pancreas and heart. It most often affects people of Northern European background and is particularly common in Celtic countries.
Okay, that's not what I thought he was. I thought he was talking about the eye.
Oh, yeah.
Thing. What was that called?
I don't remember. You're asking me to think
we
of...
talked about it,
Yeah.
but it's been a long time.
Yeah, it has been a long time.
So what was this having to do with? Like
Something
the liver?
about processing iron.
Oh.
Genetic condition where iron slowly builds up in the body.
Iron builds
This
up.
iron overload can damage parts of the body such as the liver, the joints, pancreas and heart. It most
Ooh.
often affects people of Northern European background and is particularly common in Celtic countries, such as
Interesting.
Ireland, Scotland and Wales. Given this, the condition is sometimes known as the Celtic curse.
Oh.
Now,
That's
rates of
weird. I don't know
hemochromatosis
why.
are higher in Scotland than England. In Scotland, around 1 in 113 people have this condition, compared to roughly 1 in 150 people in England. This again
That's something you would want to know if
It is something you would
cook
wanna
with
know.
cast iron or anything.
Which
you
we
probably
do.
wouldn't want to do if you had that.
Yeah, I'm guessing not. But I mean, it is prevalent compared to other areas, I'm guessing, but 1 in 13 and 1 in 113 and 1 in 150, depending on if you're England or Scotland.
Yeah.
That isn't like something the average person probably has to deal with.
Right.
But it is something to be aware of. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We cook with cast iron skillets, so
A lot of women, when they're pregnant, they end up having like low iron issues. I never had that. I always had
yeah.
good iron levels
Makes
because we
sense.
were cooking with cast iron,
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, one reason. Or eating a lot of beef. Yeah, that'll work too.
speaks to the idea that Scotland has more Celtic ancestry than England. And we also see this overarching difference when we look at the Y-DNA haplogroups of the two countries. Now, haplogroup R1b is the dominant Y-DNA lineage in both Scotland and England, reflecting their common Western European heritage. However, the subtypes of R1b most prevalent in each population differ, and speak to the different historical episodes that affected them differently. Scotland is dominated by R1b-L21. This subtype is often called the Celtic branch of R1b, as it is found in high frequencies in populations with a historic Celtic identity. In the Atlantic fringe of Europe, including Brittany and France, which still speaks a Celtic language today. R1b-L21 is found
Wow.
in around
I didn't know
75 to 80% of men in Scotland, the most common haplogroup by far. England, on the other hand, has a much higher level of the subclad R1b-U106. This branch of R1b reaches its peak frequencies in the North Sea regions, i.e. in places like the Netherlands, northwest Germany, Denmark and southeast England, and is associated with the migration of Anglo-Saxons and related Germanic peoples. England also has a Celtic backdrop though, and is thus dominated by two main branches of R1b. R1b-L21, which is higher in the north of the country and associated more with Celtic ancestry, and then R1b-U106, which is highest in the south and east of the country and is associated more with Germanic ancestry. This table shows the breakdown of the main Y-DNA haplogroups in Scotland versus England.
Huh. Okay, that's interesting. This is very interesting.
You can see how R1b-L21 dominates Scotland, but England has a mixture of these two subclads of R1b. England also has slightly higher levels of I1. This reflects the fact that England has more Northern European ancestry in general.
Wait, England has more Northern European ancestry?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's what he's saying.
That's interesting. So we got Anglo-Saxons, Frisians, Continental Germanics. Wow. And then you got, so that's and Celtic Britons, Gaels, pre-Anglo-Saxon Britons. So basically what we're seeing here, the Scottish tend to have much more of the Celtic Britons, Gaels,
Which makes
pre-Anglo-Saxon
sense
Britons.
to me.
That actually does make sense to me, yeah.
I'm assuming the haplogroups he's talking about, this is what you would find out if you did something like Ancestry DNA or one of those mail-in DNA kits. You would figure out where your genetics come from, like what region.
I think something similar to that, yeah.
I want to do that so bad. I just do not trust.
I do not trust
these
those companies. Yeah.
Maybe one day I'll get desperate enough because I really want to do it.
Yeah.
So if anyone knows of a super reputable one that doesn't sell your information,
But I will say, I feel like I've done a pretty good job with doing the research.
as much as you can.
As much as you
through
can
something like that.
to come up with ideas
Yeah.
of where you're coming from. But would it be nice to be able to
like,
know
for sure.
exactly where even before that and beyond that, and but nonetheless, the paper trail has been pretty cool. Like for example, we found your great grandpa at a church in a cemetery, like from hundreds of years ago. How cool is that?
Yeah, it was really cool. Was that in Devon or Kent? I can't remember.
I can't remember which one that was, but
In that region.
yeah, it was down south. A lot of yours was down south for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
As I1 is common in Scandinavia, as well as Northern Germany and Northern Europe in general. It is thus linked to
That
both the
is
Vikings
quite the
and
difference, though,
Anglo-Saxon
honestly.
migrations due to
Right there.
this. But the main reason for the higher rates in England is driven by this larger Anglo-Saxon component, as the
Yeah.
Viking influence was similar in both countries.
Oh, wow.
So what can we say
Yeah.
about Scottish and English DNA overall? Well, both countries have a shared genetic foundation with notable twists. Both groups are fundamentally northwestern European, sharing the ancient genetic layers of hunter-gatherers, early farmers and steppe ancestry. They also both absorbed waves of Celtic
Wow.
and Germanic migrants in the Iron Age and early medieval periods. The differences lie in the relative proportions of these inputs. The English genome shows a greater signature of Anglo-Saxon and continental European influence, where the Scottish genome retains a higher degree of indigenous Celtic ancestry. This is evident in specific genetic markers, notably the Celtic-associated R1b-L21 versus the Germanic-associated R1b-U106. We also see this in certain traits, like red hair and hemochromatosis, which are both higher in Scotland. So in other words, Scotland has more Celtic ancestry and England has more of a Germanic influence, but this is against the backdrop England obviously still has a good amount of Celtic ancestry, and we see this with R1b-L21 still found in reasonable numbers in England. Yet overall, Scotland and England genetically are very similar. If we look at the mitochondrial haplogroups, for example, we can see that the two countries have almost identical levels of these markers.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That is crazy.
That is... Okay, it's like...
I expected it to be much different than
I did too. Every percentage here is the same.
Yeah.
And now, on the other group, on the other page,
Yeah,
we were seeing
there was a bigger
There was a bigger
difference.
difference in the Anglo-Saxon versus Celtic. It seemed like that was the main thing. But this is showing a much more similar.
Yeah.
Wow.
And autosomal DNA is very similar between the two. But like I say, Scotland does have more of a Celtic influence and England more of a Germanic influence, although they are similar overall. But what does your eye colour say about your ancestry? Well,
Wow.
We actually checked that one out.
Yeah, which was eye-opening.
yeah.
Eye-opening, to say the least. But this was incredible, guys. This is so interesting to me.
It really is interesting.
Genetics is
I
just
love it.
interesting
I
in
love
general.
Learning about this stuff.
You know,
I don't always understand it.
yeah,
but
it's kind of, there's a lot to it. So it's like piece by piece, it starts becoming a little bit more complex,
Yeah.
and you start trying to piece it together. One thing at a time is easy to understand, but when you get all these different components, it's like, okay, what am I looking at exactly? But I think there's a lot of similarities, obviously, between the Scottish and the English. Share a lot of the same genetics, but on average have more or less of different components. The Anglo-Saxon and the Celtic seem to be the things that are mostly, from what I got here,
difference,
the biggest difference, it seems
Yeah.
like. And I think that kind of makes sense to me.
Yeah.
And wasn't it the Vikings on the east of England, but much more Vikings on the north of Scotland? And I never knew there were two different places Vikings were coming from.
There might even be more than two. I don't
now I'm guessing there probably is.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've never really actually looked
It
into
makes
the
me want to
Vikings.
watch the show Vikings. I don't know how historically accurate that is.
It kind of makes me want to learn about the Vikings, because that's obviously a big subgroup that came into Great Britain and is part of the DNA of, well, all the people, generally speaking, that at least have been on the island for centuries, you know. Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
But, you know, it really gets me thinking. It's like, I kind of want to look at the different groups. I want to look at the Celts themselves, the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxons. He didn't really talk much about the Normans.
No.
I'm guessing maybe that was less
Probably less
of an influence. And then there was, who else?
I don't know. He said a bunch of different.
There's the other ones. Yeah, like,
Yeah.
I can't think off the top of my head, but wow, this is really, really interesting, guys.
Yeah.
Anyways, let us know what you think.
And if you know your genetic makeup, what your ancestry is, we'd love to know in the comments.
Yeah. And hopefully one day we can actually get our actual DNA done. But
Yes, like I said, if you know of a company that does not sell your information,
yeah.
please let us know.
But, you know, it's interesting that by doing it, tracing your line, step by step by step, you can get pretty far with it. You know, I've got a decent way on different lines, not all my lines and whatnot,
Yeah.
but and another thing you can look at is, generally speaking, you can easily get a general idea based off of the male line last names.
Yeah.
So your dad's last name, for example, you can trace out where does that likely come from. your mom's dad's last name and their dad's last names and so forth. You can actually start tracing that way and actually get a good idea. That's not obviously as perfect, but generally speaking, most last names came from a local area or a profession in a particular country or whatnot.
Yeah.
And that's where they originated. True. And but obviously
still to have it all laid out and know exactly would be cool.
Yeah, I agree. But anyways, guys, I think that's it for today. Thank you so much for stopping by. Please click that like button. Feel free to drop your comments or suggestions about this video or others. And don't forget to subscribe to continue to follow us on our journey. Until next time, peace.
And happy Easter.
Oh, yeah, and happy Easter.